Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April meeting of the Economic Planning and Housing Committee. We've got some housekeeping before we start. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately and meet in the War Memorial Park. The fire exits are located at the rear of this room, and if you go down the stairs, you'll get out to the park. Please note that this meeting is being webcast live on the internet, and if everyone can turn their mobile phones off or onto silent, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Apologies for absence. I should inform those members who are not aware that I had apologies from the leader of the Labour group on behalf of his group for this evening's meeting. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. May I inquire, is that as a result of illness?
No, I was told that was... He sent an email to me, which I'm happy to circulate to members, because he has a view on the County Council election purdah, and he believes that this meeting should not take place, and that's his view. But I have received different advice from officers which informed me that this meeting can in fact take place. I've agreed with that advice, and unfortunately Councillor Harvey was not happy with that. Okay, item 2, appointment of a vice chairman. Do we have any nominations? Nope. We'll move to item 3, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Nope. Item 4, urgent matters, of which there are none. So we'll move to item 5 to approve the minutes of the last meeting held on 23rd of March. Are there any comments to be made on the minutes, or are you all happy for me to sign those? Okay, I'll do those in a moment. Item 6, we have motions referred from full council from the previous meeting on the 30th of March. The first one is on the gender pay gap, which was moved by Councillor Ashfield and seconded by Councillor Freeman. They asked the council to note 5 points and asks the committee to undertake further analysis in order to understand the drivers for significant differences in the borough with regard to the gender pay gap compared to the rest of the South East, and to propose a strategy via the normal decision-making process in order to tackle the issue of declining female salaries and the growing gap between male and female pay. I think we had a good discussion on that at full council cross-party. I know that the officers are happy to take that and look at that more in depth. Does anybody want to give the officers a bit more of a steer on that? Councillor Golding.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't get the opportunity to express my support for the motion on the night, but I will do so now. I do think it's a very important issue, but I think it's an issue that we really need to understand fully, understand what the facts and figures are actually meaning, and the significance, and I think that's probably where I would like the officers to start.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm sure that's been noted, and the officers will take that into account when they look into it, and we'll bring it back to committee. Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair, but I think Councillor Parker's hand was up before mine.
Thank you, Chair. Would I be right in noting this as a Labour motion?
It is, yes.
Well, I would think maybe in the absence of the Labour Party, then perhaps we should be deferring this item on the agenda so that they can be present and participate. I think it's, and I would like this minuted, I think it's actually very poor behaviour on their behalf to not be attending here tonight. My own question, that's my note on this particular point, and I also make that same observation on the other motion. As far as this particular question is concerned, I'd like to ask, where do we stand as an employer in that regard?
I think the main thing to note on this is that it's a motion that's gone for full council. It received unanimous support at full council, and we're simply asking at this point as a committee for the officers to go away and do some more work. And I'd certainly envisage that group leaders appoint representatives to perhaps work with the officers and direct them on this, so we can look into the issue fully, and then all councillors can be part of a solution. I think what we're really asking to do is just ask the officers to go away, pull some things together, and councillors can contribute to that, and it will be brought back to the committee in the fullness of time. Would you be comfortable with that?
I just think in terms of general procedure and protocol, I think it's doesn't reflect very well in terms of they have put forward a motion to full council. I appreciate there was a detailed discussion on that, and it's being recommended to this committee. They have members on this committee, and they've chosen not to be here tonight when that appears on the agenda. And I think that's actually reflects badly.
Councillor Rattigan.
So,
Councillor Frost, I do apologise.
sorry.
Thank you very much, Chair. Whilst I agree with Councillor Parker with some sentiment, in fact I think it's a shame that they're not here, I personally think this is too important a motion to actually delay. I think officers should take the motion and run with it, so that we can understand the drivers behind the pay gap and move forward swiftly and at a pace. So I personally would not like to see this deferred until the Labour Group members can be here.
Thank you, Councillor Rattigan.
I very much respect what Councillor Parker says about deferring it, but I agree with Councillor Frost. I'm going to call you first name. I do think the workings of this council should not be delayed by party political play acting, not turning up for meetings. We have a responsibility, not just in this council chamber, but to the wider borough, to find out if there is a problem within this borough about unequal pay between men and women. And I think, you know, the time it's going to take for the officers to get set up, start the work, an undue delay is not required, and they will be back to voice their opinions in the future. And I'm sure on this sensitive issue, I think they will want their voice to be heard at a future date, and therefore I think let's get on with the work, let's get the officers cracking on this.
I sense that we're all in agreement now that we'll ask the officers to go away and look into this, and we'll bring it back and members can contribute to that in due course. Councillor Parker.
Can somebody sometime give me some information as per my question in relation to how do we sit as an employer in regard to this specific matter? We're looking to maybe influence other organisations, I would assume, possibly as the outcome of this work. It would be very worthwhile knowing how are things measured and how do we sit in relation to equal pay.
Absolutely, I think that's something that the officers have made a note of, and they'll absolutely look at that, because as you say, as the Borough Council, we can't be expecting other employers to take a stand on this issue if we're not doing so ourselves, so we'll absolutely look into that. The second motion that we've got is the audit of office to residential permitted development, which is a motion that went before full council. I believe there was unanimous support in the chamber for this one too, and it requests that officers undertake an audit of office to residential permitted development in Basingstoke and Deane, including collating the number of units and floor space sizes proposed and delivered in these developments. The data be presented to this committee where consideration can be given to issues raised by the audit. I know that the officers are happy, and I know that the portfolio holder is happy. The portfolio holder is itching to say something, I can see.
Well, as members know, Chairman, I supported this at full council, and I've discussed it with the officers, and they're hoping to bring something back to the committee, perhaps in July, if the work programme allows. I'm
certainly content with that. Are members content with that? Perfect. We will bring that back in due course. In which case, we now come to item 7. Item 7 is an overview of, is a rather odd item in the sense that it's an overview of the subsequent reports for members. So there are the 3 reports which have been prepared. We are joined by Councillor Mark Raffel as the portfolio holder, by Matthew Evans and by Mark Lambert as officers, and I believe that Councillor Raffel is going to introduce and say a few words.
Thank you, Chairman. I hope members found that the overview paper was useful, just to put in context how these 3 other papers are interlinked and how when we decide some of the issues on one, we have to bear in mind that if they aren't captured with one system, some of our thoughts and the processes are captured with a different system. During the course of discussions, we'll move through those 3 papers, but at some point, convenient to you, Chairman, I think it's very important that we raise the issue regarding the sill rate for Manydown. There was a short, very short briefing paper supplied to members of the committee yesterday, and I know that in due course there will be a full report supplied to all members for full council when we discuss, I think it's the second full council in May. But when that's convenient, I may say something a little bit more about that. That's all I wish to say, because we really want to hear from members on this. Can I say that obviously the spend and governance paper, I think the officers in due course will say they've tried to work out what they think is the best option, but it's very much open to discussion, as in what do you think it's going out for consultation, and we want to bear in mind and listen to what you've got to say. The earlier papers, whilst obviously they are obviously open to discussion and consideration of what you're going to say, but they're slightly more constrained, especially the planning obligations SPD paper and that sort of thing. It's about tweaking the paper that I'm looking for those sorts of comments.
Thank you very much. I believe that Matthew Evans is going to talk us through the short note that was prepared for us yesterday on the sill in more depth, and then we can go into that.
Happy to.
Purely on the paper that was circulated yesterday.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, members of the committee would have received the update note yesterday, which sets out the current position in relation to community infrastructure levy. Members will recall that there was a consultation in the late summer of last year, following agreement at full council, which was a revised draft sill charging schedule, and that set out a range of tariffs for different forms of development, but also for different strategic allocations within the plan. That went out to consultation. We received a response and looked at those in some detail. The outcome of that consultation is that we felt the need to do some additional viability work around costs associated with the Manydown strategic allocation, and in particular the focus of that work was around the costs of the country park, which forms part of the allocation, but also to review likely increase in costs related to highway and transportation improvements, and that reflected the fact that the scheme had been developed and was reaching a stage where it was getting close to an application has been received, and now an application has been put in. The conclusions of that is that the recommendation to full council will be that the sill rate for the residential development on the Manydown site should be reduced from £60 per square metre to £50 per square metre, and that reflected the review of the viability work and the inclusion of the assessment of the value of the country park and the transportation improvements. Now, the outcome of that, as I say, is to reduce the tariff to 50 square metres, but certainly the view we've had, and we've taken independent advice, is that will still allow sufficient viability to provide a development which meets the policy requirements of the adopted local plan. And that includes taking into account 40% of the residential development being affordable housing, and includes a significant buffer of 46% to reflect unknown costs which are always associated with what is a very large development. So in terms of process, that will go as a report to full council on the 18th of May, and that will provide councillors with the detail behind that. And the report will seek approval of a statement of modifications. That's a process which is allowed for in the legislation. Assuming approval by full council, that will be subject to consultation for a 4-week period. and that will be the responses we receive, together with all the responses we previously received, will be put in front of a examiner in due course, and the indicative date is late July, with the intention of adopting the SIL later in the SIL rates later in the year, hopefully with implementation in November. So in terms of what the full council report will include, it will be the approval of an updated Regulation 123 list, which is a factual update, and it will also include the withdrawal of an earlier draft SIL charging schedule, which was published back in 2014, which has never been formally withdrawn. So the opportunity will be taken just to withdraw that earlier draft charging schedule. I hope that helps, and obviously happy to take questions on that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's really helpful to get that up front so that we understand that we've got the overview of reports and then the subsequent advice that went out yesterday. This report is just an overview report, but I'm sure that members will wish to comment and ask some questions of the officers on this, and then we'll come to the subsequent 3 papers afterwards. So are there any comments on this paper? Councillor Rattigan.
Firstly, the reduction in the SIL charge, is it just for this area it's in for planning at the moment, and will it be extended to the other areas as we develop the greater Manidown proposal?
Chair, if I may, the tariff applies to all the residential development within the whole of the Manidown allocation. So that there's 3 sites, or I think 4 sites in terms of separate ownership. So that tariff will apply to all the residential development across the full allocation.
Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just a bit confused here. I mean, we've had a SIL schedule that was set out, okay, where we've already given the Manidown site a buffer of 43%, okay, and now you're coming to us saying that you want to give them another tenner. Okay, I don't see the justification for it, and hope that you'll be able to enlighten me on that.
Thank you, Chair. It's important when you set SIL rates that you have an appropriately sized buffer to allow for any kind of unknown costs that come forward as the development is progressed. And so we feel it's important to maintain a buffer of around 40% going forwards. When you factor in additional costs associated with the development site, so as Matthew outlined, the country park land value and the additional costs associated with the highway works, you're adding in additional costs to that development, and consequently you have to bring down the SIL rate to reflect that. As I said, we think it's important to maintain a buffer, and the buffer that we're suggesting is a 46%, but the consequence of that is that the SIL rate drops from £60 to £50.
Councillor Frost again.
Thank you, Chair. I may have got hold of the wrong end of the stick here, okay, but you know, under the second viability study that we've done, okay, or the council has conducted, we've already taken into consideration various costs, okay, and we've given a buffer which is say a 40-odd%. My understanding is that that's 46%. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's an extra 6% already from what you said, and now you want to reduce the SIL rate further by another 10%. So can you please give me the actual percentage of the buffer zone, of the buffer amount that you're wanting to give to Manidown?
The buffer in the previous viability assessment that you referred to was 43%. And so we're increasing that to 46%, and that's also partly down to the fact that we've slightly rounded the figures, because it's generally appropriate that when you present a SIL schedule going forward, that the figures are rounded generally to the nearest £10.
Councillor Golding.
Thank you. We had this at committee a little while ago, and the consultants that we'd worked with then were very confident and actually stood up to quite a lot of questioning that £60 was the right amount for many down. So have they been involved in this kind of review, or has that come just from us internally?
The work that we've taken forward has been in partnership with the consultants we used previously, and of course we factored in those additional costs which they've factored into their viability model, the outcome of which is a reduction in the sill rate. So in answer to your question, yes, we have involved the same consultants.
Councillor Golding.
Can I ask the really awkward question why they weren't factored in the first place then, please?
It's partly in response to the comments we've received from the various landowners and developers in the borough in response to the consultation on the last draft charging schedule. We've received comments from the many down landowners that some of the assumptions we used weren't quite correct. We've looked into that in more detail. We've spoken to Hampshire County Council as a highway authority around the likely implications of the development. And now that we know more about the scheme, since we've had the pre-application discussion with the landowners, they're in a better position to understand the quantum of costs involved in improving those junctions.
Councillor Rattigan.
Further to Councillor Goulding's point, we paid these consultants quite a lot of money, frankly, and they have come up with poor advice, ill thought out, and can barely hold water 6 months later, frankly. And I would like a report back to here for what we've paid them twice for consultations, because frankly it's not working for me. A 3% increase in the buffer. How much money is that? Just tell me in how much, not as a percentage, how much actual cash is that?
If I could answer your first point first, and perhaps come back to your second point about the actual amount, because I haven't got that to hand. But the modelling that's undertaken by the consultant is all based upon the assumptions that we feed into that model, and we've had to take we've had to make these assumptions ourselves based upon what we think will happen. So because SIL is a theoretical exercise, effectively. Obviously, now we're getting more detail about the scale of the application through the quantum of time. Then we know more about which junctions, for example, will need to be mitigated, and the likely scale of that mitigation and the costs associated with it.
If I may, Chairman, just to add to that point, I think the key reason why we've had to make a recommendation to change the tariff is because of the changing situation of in terms of what the landowner side, the developer side, have been providing to us. Their position on the countryside, on the country park, shifted towards the end of last year in terms of its relationship with the development. So that's a change in position from them, which we then had to respond to as part of our assessment of the tariff. And in terms of the infrastructure side, the highways side, again, that's been a bit of a movable feast in terms of what the landowner has proposed. And inevitably, as the scheme is worked up in more detail, and that's been the process last year, and we're now at a stage where we've got a planning application in, the nature of the infrastructure has changed. So I think it was inevitable to an extent that the assumptions would develop and change as we got closer to a planning application. And I think it would have been wrong for us at this stage not to have taken those into account, because I'm very certain that an inspector, when he or she considers the tariff, would want to know the latest position. So I understand the point about it changing, but to an extent that's because we've had to respond to the changing nature of the development.
We all came to committee. You just said it's inevitable, but it wasn't flagged to us as a committee previously. So why didn't you take the opportunity to say to us, actually, these figures are going to change because it's always inevitable that it happens? But you didn't do that. Your consultants didn't do that. And I think that's a breach of our trust.
I don't necessarily expect the officer to comment on that, but I think the point is made. Councillor Frost.
Just really to back up Councillor Rattigan's point, I too was at the meeting where SIL was originally discussed, and I'm a bit perturbed that we've suddenly gone from quite a high level, okay, to £60, and now we've gone to 50. are we going to get a 40, you know, or 30, or even reduce it even further because of viability issues on the site? Just how movable is this going to be?
I think that's fairly speculative, but if the officer wants to comment. Then.
Explain the process, and I suppose it's worth just reminding ourselves that the tariff which was debated at this committee last year was always a draft. It was a draft for consultation, and so part of that process is to take account of what we receive from all parties as part of that consultation. But in terms of your second point is what will happen and will it change again, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the examiner, when he or she considers the tariff later in the year, it's within their gift to recommend changes in that tariff. So ultimately it will be down to the examiner, on the basis of the evidence which is submitted to him, to come to a final conclusion and recommendation.
Thank you. I have a list. I have Councillor Golding, Councillor Parker, Councillor Richards, Councillor Rattigan, and then Councillor Frost. We will get round to you all. Councillor... You can, go on.
So does this mean that in areas of the rural borough, okay, of which certainly my ward is one of, okay, that we have a sill level of a proposed sill level of £200 per square metre? Does that mean that if we have a development in my ward, that we can expect fairly decent buffers to bring the cost of the sill down?
In terms of the process, once the examiner has made a recommendation on all the tariffs, and I know we're focusing on many down, but he or she will have a number of tariffs, number of sill levels to test. Once they've made that recommendation, and then that recommendation is endorsed by the council and the sill is adopted, then that will be the tariff which developers will have to pay. There's no process for individual schemes to try and renegotiate that. The tariff will be what it is, and that will be what the council will require individual developers to pay.
Councillor Golding.
Thank you. I'm approaching this very much from the point of view of us wanting to get sill through inspection first time, and therefore my concern is that the changes you've described don't actually sound that substantial or that significant, but actually the cost involved does seem like quite a big change. How confident are you that that will get through inspection?
Slightly nervous about trying to predict an outcome of what an examiner will say. I think from our perspective, I think we've put an awful lot of effort into coming up with a robust evidence base. We've appointed consultants to look at a range of the assumptions underlying the evidence base. So I think our position is that we can go to the examination putting forward, I think, the strongest position we can to support the tariffs which are set out. But ultimately, it's a judgment for the examiner, and clearly they will want to take into account the opposing views, which no doubt will be submitted to them. But as I say, just to recap, I think our position is that we've done everything we can to provide a robust evidence base to support the recommended tariffs.
Councillor Parker.
Could I just seek confirmation from officers on some fundamentals here, that this sort of hot potato that we're kicking around is that the higher the sill rate, the least it is liked by the developer. The lower the sill rate, the more favourable it's viewed by the developer. Would that be a fundamental correct assessment? I also was at the committee meeting when we had, I felt, very good participation from members, specifically on this one particular tariff. In fact, there was, I believe, pretty much a consensus of opinion that the £60 rate was even lower than it maybe ought to be. So it's with disappointment that I find that we are now viewing a further reduction in that rate. And the question that I'm not putting to officers, but is in my mind, is whether the pressure from the developer argument is having sway over what is going to be, in our view as a local authority, the best for our residents. It's been mentioned by Matthew that the one contributing factor in relation to arriving at this decision for a £10 reduction was the landowner's attitude having shifted to the country park. Now, I don't think any of us as committee members want to be around the desk when all these things are being discussed and being agreed and being appraised, but that's the sort of thing I think we need more information on, which is effectively should become in terms a hard factor, not a soft factor. What is the shift? What implication does that shift have in terms of the deliberations that have been made to arrive at that decision? So that we can better understand how this mechanism is functioning, because I worry that we're effectively, Chair, rolling over.
Thank you. Do the officers want to respond to that? Yes.
Just in terms of the country park and the land upon which it sits, this was a point that was made to us during the consultations, and the landowners felt that we hadn't taken into account the cost of providing that land for the country park. And that's really a key cost that we've had to factor in subsequently into the viability equation.
Councillor Parker.
What I'm hearing is that somebody has said, whilst we were definitely planning a country park in the development of Manydown, we didn't take into account the cost of providing that country park. It just seems a fundamental error then, if that's what we've done.
Perhaps it would help if I just
Matthew.
explain how the position, as I see it, from the landowner has changed. At the time of the local plan examination, the sort of agreed position between the LPA and the landowner was that the country park would be provided by way of Section 106, the provision of it, but the actual cost of laying it out would come from SIL, and it wasn't the country park itself isn't a specific requirement coming out of the development. It's not needed. It wasn't at that time needed to make the development acceptable in planning terms, because the country park is there to meet a wider need rather than specifically the need of the new housing on Manydown. But where the position has shifted is that the landowner side, the developer side, has indicated that part of the country park will be needed to mitigate the impact of the development. So things like relating to biodiversity, for example, are needed to offset the impact of the development. So that required us to revisit the valuation of the country park, which previously we gave no value to. So we had to get some external valuation advice, and the advice we were given, and it will be in the report to full council, is that it should be agricultural value, and I think that's right, because the country park has no development value for a range of reasons. But even putting in that agricultural value element into the viability calculations, which we got consultants to do, that required us to shift the tariff level. And then once you added that to the additional highway costs, which have come out of more detailed and refined work around the transport requirements of development, that introduces additional costs, which then had to be factored into the viability costs. the whole issue around the country park was one where we had to take quite a lot of external advice because it's a complex issue, and I think it's fair to say that I don't expect the developer side necessarily to agree with us, but I think we've got a robust position in terms of how you value the country park. But as I say, we had to respond to a shift in position from the developer side as they develop their scheme.
Can I just say,
Councillor Raphael.
to members, from my perspective, just keep asking questions. This is not straightforward, and you're playing slightly catch up on this. It seemed to me that it's vitally important we brought this to you as soon as we possibly could, and these decisions have only just been made. We could have been left to full council because it's a full council amendment, and you can imagine the difficulties we would have had handling it then. So we're in no rush. If thoughts are occurring to you which may or may not necessarily be moving in a straight line to flesh this out, then just keep asking the questions. All right. So you may be getting sort of answers to some things, but that might spur you on to ask other questions. It's not straightforward. It's been quite complicated because if on one hand you've got a policy team, on the other hand you've got a developer, and the developer's trying to get their best value in the circumstance. It just happens that the developer happens to be another part of this council, and so they're driving as hard a possible bargain they can get. The other thing I should say to you is that you can have confidence in the experts because they were the experts that were involved with the local plan, dealing with viability and other things, and their assessments and their reports were endorsed by the inspector, and that's why we have confidence in their views and working with them and continuing to work with them. If we hadn't have gone back to the experts and said, what do you think about this? It could have all unravelled at inspection. If, having gone back, they'd said no change, then the fact they'd said no change would have still gone before the inspector, because the developer is pushing potentially for a different position, and so it would have come out. If they say change, and we hadn't adopted that change, it would have unravelled. And we are driven, we work on an evidence basis, the policy team, that we follow the evidence. The evidence tells us that this is where we should go, and we can't pick and choose which parts of it or which part of the experts' report we adopt. But because it's quite complex, and it's all happened rather suddenly, and we're trying to keep to the timetable for submission on SIL, that's why it's sort of come about in the way it has with this discussion tonight. So if you want to just keep, I mean, I know you're under the guidance of the chairman, but we're very receptive to the fact that this has come at you quite late.
Thank you, Councillor Felt. You can, Councillor Parker.
Well, it's just again from the explanation that was given to us by Matthew, which I need just to make sure I am understanding correctly. When the whole of Many Down development is completed, who will own the country park?
The answer is we don't know. And that's ultimately a decision for the developer. Through the planning process, we'll want to make sure that it's provided and secured and the maintenance arrangements in place. But really, in the same way as other areas of open space, the actual decision about who owns it and who maintains it is not one for the local planning authority. That's for the developer.
Thank you. I mean, that's certainly my understanding, and we had the all-member briefing on Many Down, and the key thing with the country park is we don't know enough yet. We know that it's included, we know that it's going to be part of the the outline planning application, which has now been submitted, but we don't know enough yet. And certainly from a ward member point of view, I don't know enough yet about the ownership of the country park on an ongoing basis, and indeed the governance of that at a later date. I think just before we go, I'd like to comment from the chair. I think a lot of the concern from members has been surrounding this drop from £60 to £50, and from what we've been hearing tonight, that's mainly focused around the country park. And I think whilst I can certainly understand, or we can understand, that there are differences in viability that result from the highways and transport studies, did I hear correctly that on the original submission to the inspector there was no value attributed to the country park. Was that correct?
Mark has got more detail, but my understanding is that the original position of the landowner is that the country park would be it would be provided by way of Section 106, but it would be SIL which would provide its maintenance, and on that basis, we didn't apportion a cost to the country park in terms of the viability issues. But because of that shift in position from the developer side, where we've had to respond to that by including a value of the country park in the overall viability assessments. And as I said before, the value we've attached to it is agricultural value. But
sorry, but that's changed the viability sufficiently in the overall SIL amount to knock down from £60 to £50, and that's a contributing factor.
It's a contributing factor when you add that to the additional transportation costs and the highway costs, which we've had to now factor in.
I appreciate that we're at a place now where we can't change that, but I think that's regrettable, and I think hindsight's obviously a wonderful thing, but not applying a value to the country park in the first instance has possibly caused a lot of this discussion. I've got a long list of members. I'll just rattle through so that you know you're on the list. I've got Councillor Richards, Councillor Rattigan, Councillor Golding and Councillor Frost. Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I just say I too was a little shocked when I saw this reduction from 60 to 50 pounds per square metre, and okay, I've listened to the arguments, and we haven't actually seen a detailed analysis, so it's still a little bit difficult for me to comprehend. But one thing you did say, Matthew, is when it goes to the examiner. Now, the examiner makes a judgment, I take it. You inferred that the examiner could actually increase the SIL, or is he likely to increase the SIL, or more likely to decrease it? I mean, where does he stand on this sort of issue? And would our consultants have enough experience of working with these examiners to give us advice on that?
Through you, Chairman, the examiner has the ability to change the tariff, but he doesn't have, from the advice I've had from Mark, the ability to recommend that the tariff goes up. So he can do a couple of things. He can agree with the tariff we've proposed, but he can also recommend that the tariff goes down, because the test for him will be around viability and the confidence that we haven't set the tariff at such a level that it affects the viability of the development.
Can I just pick up on that briefly? That's a test of viability, but on that test of viability there is only two answers, and that's it is viable at this current level, or it's not viable, in which case it goes down, and there's not a situation where something could actually be, and I'm playing with words here, but over viable. The inspector cannot make that decision. Is that a statutory thing, or is that?
The difficulty an inspector would have, or an examiner would have, is that he wouldn't have any evidence in front of him which would suggest that tariffs should be set higher. He will have evidence from the council which will suggest that £50 per square metre is the right level, but clearly what he will also have is he will have evidence from other parties who will suggest that the tariff should be set at a lower level, or even removed altogether. So he won't. Bear in mind, he has to base his position on the evidence in front of him. It seems to me very difficult for him to actually suggest that the tariff figure will be increased. And certainly the evidence from other examinations is that we're not aware of any situation where an inspector has done that. They either agree with the figure or they push it down.
I understand that, and I do understand that the examiner has to take a decision on the evidence in front of him. It just seems that it is, from a local authority point of view, rather one-sided, in that the examiner has evidence to show this level is correct, evidence from the developers to show it should be lower, but actually are the local authorities missing a trick perhaps in not showing that not only it should be that level, it could even be more. But there we are. Councillor Richards.
So, I mean, is this not a negotiation? I mean, shouldn't we treat it as a negotiation? And when you go into a negotiation, be it Brexit, be it examiner for Sill, you can you shoot high, knowing that you or having room to come down. I mean, that would be that's my instinct. I have to say, having done negotiating in the past.
I think I'd agree with what you said, Councillor. Brexit aside, I'd agree with what you said, Councillor Richards. I think the council puts together the case, and I've just been advised that if the level is set too high, the examiner can just throw the whole thing out, rather than just amending it. I'll get the officer to clarify, so it's 100% correct.
I think if there's uncertainty that the level that the council is suggesting is incorrect, the inspector will either take the level down or will ask us to go away and look at a particular issue in more detail that's come up during the examination process to see if the figure in fact we've come up with is correct. So we may be packed off during the examination to look in a bit more detail at a certain cost or assumption we've made.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rattigan was next.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things for the full council meeting. Can we have in cash terms the differential between 43% and 46%, so that shows it in cash terms? And can we also see the cash terms reduction from 50 to 60, so as we know how many millions that will be over the development and over the course of the four sites over time, because that is going to be substantive, and it's going to be enough. That's money for the whole of this borough that could impact people's lives. And obviously, if we are 60 of us sitting here, it's well important that we don't just focus on Mannydown producing for Mannydown, but it's also Mannydown producing for the rest of the borough. So those are a couple of points for the full council, if I may. Secondly, this is not a theoretical exercise, and I totally get that. This is a starting point that you have started by sending us these papers yesterday, that we are going to be pressured by the developers to reduce the sill to almost nothing. And it seems completely unfair to me that representing a rural ward, that our sill rate is set at 200, and we're expecting Mannydown to get a discount of 75% over what we pay. Now, there are good reasons why we want to deliver Mannydown for the better borough, but it is frankly frightening when local people in my ward want to bring forward a small development on a piece of land that they hold, and they are going to be charged a complete fortune compared to big developers like Barrett or Redrow or whoever's going to be developing these sites, who get a reduction in their sill rate and add to their profit, when individuals in my ward who are not looking to make a profit but are looking to have a decent house will be penalised by the sill rate. So those are things that are emotive to me, but also I don't want this being a slippery slope of we get to the inspector and we find out that actually the arguments we've put up are not robust enough to protect a sill rate even at 50 quid. So we need to do quite a lot of work to convince me that we shouldn't be shooting high and letting the inspector call us down, because we've put in nearly a 50% buffer. People don't do that in their own businesses. They don't. If you're building your own house, you don't put a 50% buffer in it to put an extension on. That just seems ridiculous to me. And I know there are different examples, because there's a small development for somebody, and a huge development in Mannydown. But nobody puts that sort of buffer into their costings for their own houses, and they would. Individuals in this borough will think that's completely crazy. So these are just some thoughts that I've got. But this paper and coming back to us has raised far more questions than it's given us answers, if I'm really honest. And I expect the paper to full council to be robust enough for you to argue it, and for the portfolio holder to stand there and say, yes, this is going to work without exception. But you can't say that because we are left still swinging in the wind as to what we get back, you know, as to our sill rates. I am deeply worried long term on this.
Thank you. Councillor Golding.
Thank you. I have two slightly separate questions, if I may, Chair. My understanding on reading the papers was that actually the inspector also had the option of reverting to a previous draft. So if we failed to provide sufficient evidence for this reduction from £60 to £50, he could choose to go back to the original £60 draft.
I don't think that would be the case. I think what's within the gift of the inspector is to weigh up the evidence which he's received from all parties and either confirm the local planning authority's position, accept the developer's position on the basis of the evidence which they've submitted and come up with a lower figure, or alternatively, if he's not convinced that he's got all the sufficient evidence in front of him to come to review, as we said earlier, he has also got the option to say to the LPA, go away and do some more work and bring it in front of me. So he's not in position to revert to the 60, because in fact he won't have the 60 square metres in front of him to consider. The £60 in play. I think that the challenge we've got is that the purpose of the examination is to test the local planning authority's view of what the right tariff is. So we have to offer a tariff, and a tariff which the council is confident is the right tariff based on the evidence. So we can't give them a sort of a range of options to look at. It's the position that the tariff we think is the right tariff, and for the examiner to test against all the evidence which is in front of him.
You had a second point, Councillor Golding.
We've touched on the country park a little bit. We haven't really talked much about the changes in transportation and roads. I just wonder if you could explain exactly what those changes are, because I'm slightly concerned that they might be related to the sudden preference for a roundabout instead of a stepped junction, which, as far as I'm aware, is actually not the preference of the local residents.
Thank you, Chair. The changes that we've made really come about as a result of discussions with the Highways Authority on the back of the pre-application discussions we had previously on that. The additional costs really come from further junctions that we've included into the package of junctions that need to be mitigated, rather than changes to designs of junctions. Again, it's a theoretical exercise, but we want to make sure that what we're kind of taking into account is as valid as it can be, until, you know, we won't have the detail on that until the Highway Authority have confirmed that what we've got before us at the moment in terms of the application is acceptable. So we've had to make a judgment on which junctions need to be mitigated and approximately how much that will cost.
Thank you. Finally, Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come back to a comment that Councillor Rafael made, I think in seeking to clarify. And I just want to seek clarification. So effectively, with the reduction from £60 to £50 with SIL, you're saying that it's mainly to do with the country park and also infrastructure changes that come about, and the country park was due to a major shift in the position of the developer team, and which is part of the borough, and they're being particularly hard-nosed. So and this bit I'd like clarification on. So you're basically saying that we've effectively got to pay £10 or have a reduction instead of £10 because we are negotiating with ourselves and we are failing? Is that correct?
That wasn't what I was saying. I think one has to remember that there's the landowner, there's the county council, and there's the borough council. And they are seeking to get the best result for the borough and the county council and the landowner. So that's their position. And they are driving a hard bargain, as you'd expect them to do if they were a private developer on the outside. That's the position. I mean, they are pushing, and if they decide, as they did do, to say that the country park had a value, which is what it came about, then and produced evidence to suggest why they came to that view, the officers quite rightly had to consider and take that forward, because if they just said, well, we're not just ignoring that, it would all come out in the wash inspection. So they considered the point of view, came up with their own view, which is different again, having taken legal advice and valuation advice, and that has then fallen into the position we've now got. So it is mighty difficult, the whole of this, and we're all sitting on the outside. And as I've said to some members before, who perhaps aren't here, that some of them think they're probably the best negotiators and think they could do all of this straight away, and without any of this becoming a problem. Well, they're just wrong. And we as an authority have to take independent advice, whether that be legal or from appropriate people to deal with valuations. And we can't sort of pick and choose that, well, actually, we think we know better than them, because the inspector will just laugh and say, well, who are you? So when they've got the top experts and other lawyers saying how valuations are determined on the other side, if we just turn around and say, well, actually, we stuck our finger in the air as a borough council and think we know better, they'll just laugh at us. And so we are, as I've said to all of you many times during the local plan process, dependent on what the experts tell us. And we can have some confidence with these experts because they've already been through the process with us on the local plan. And they're robust enough and withstood the challenges or discussions that went on at that stage. So that's why I'm placing my confidence in what they're saying on behalf of the borough.
Councillor Rattigan.
Before the full council, can I have from you a confirmation of, if we retain the £60 sill, what the buffer would have to go down to? So if it would be 35%, 28%, whatever that figure is for the papers, please. So as we have a choice at full council, if we reduce the buffer, maybe we can keep the sill at the right a level that is acceptable to me, everybody, because that's, I think, we ought to be given choices at least.
Thank you. I think that's a very helpful point. That's certainly something I'd like to see if we can do that. I believe that we can. I think the key point here for me is that we're all trying to get the best for the borough here, and I'm looking at the SIL timetable, and currently we're hoping to submit in April, May, examination, examiner's report, and adoption by council in October, which means that we can begin charging immediately after that, which is October, November. One of the things that I'm very conscious of is that the outline planning application for Manydown has already been submitted, and SIL becomes payable at the time that the planning application is decided. And one of the things that I would hate to happen is for us to be sat here with the best of intentions, trying to do the best for the borough on SIL levels, and we're considering the merits of £50 v £60, but actually if we delay the process to such a point where the planning application for Manydown is decided before we have SIL in place, we will actually be left with zero. And I think that's the reality of the situation that we're in that it would be good to have those options in full council, but certainly from the planning guys' point of view, I think they're certainly doing their best to get something in place so that we can levy SIL on Manydown, which would be very important. Councillor Rattigan.
I don't agree with our leader who once said no deal is better than a bad deal, so I agree with your comment on it. Let's get the SIL in place.
Thank you. In that case, we will move swiftly on to item 8, which concerns section 106 contributions. The paper's focused around the current process for securing section 106 obligations and suggests improvements to be made, and I believe it's going to be introduced by Matthew.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a few words of introduction. Obviously, happy to take questions. This report is before EPH because of concerns expressed by members in the past about transparency, about how the money which is collected through the Section 106 process is spent, and the engagement with members that process allows for. What the report sets out is a number of improvements which have been put in place to aid that issue of transparency and to be clear about what money is in place and giving some confidence that there is a focus on getting that money spent, which is quite right. By way of a bit of background, it's worth recognising that because of changes in legislation over the last few years in terms of Section 106 and the constraints which the law has put in place around pooling, and that you're not allowed to pool contributions towards from more than, I think it's more than 5 developments. Since 2015, the mechanism for Section 106 has changed anyway, and Section 106s which are negotiated from that date have to be much more specific in terms of what any financial contributions need to be spent on, and it has to be a defined project, and that's now set out in Section 106s. So that provides less scope than perhaps has been in the past to consider priorities for spending. Worth looking forward, and we talked a lot about SIL tonight, and one of the benefits of SIL is that provides much more flexibility in what money can be spent on, and hence the reports which are in front of you for consideration later. But Section 106 will still apply, but in a much more narrow, more defined way, and that will focus on specific requirements needed to make individual developments acceptable. So just picking up some of the key changes which have been put in place, and obviously feedback from members will be helpful on whether these go far enough. 2.3 of the report on page 39, that sets out the provisions which are in place to share information with members, and regular reports now go on Sinbad, and also quarterly statements, and that information is also circulated to parish councils. So a lot more transparency, a lot more information there for members to consider. What the report also does I think, and this is for the first time this has been shared, this is a process map, and that's on page 47 and 48. The first page shows how the process of negotiating Section 106s take place, and members' involvement in that. And then the second page sets out the processes by which money is spent, how it goes into the capital programme, and again the involvement of ward members. I think at that point, Chair, I'll stop talking, but hopefully that gives an overview. Maybe just to highlight that clearly there's tables there with a lot of financial information involved. Again, that's shared with members, and the figures in front of you are very much a snapshot in time. They're updated and reviewed on a regular basis by the financial team. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really helpful introduction, and certainly the process map and officer responsibilities on page 47, as you said, that was really helpful for me personally, I think, to understand. I think looking at the nods around the room, that's been helpful to a lot of members in understanding the process. If we do questions to officers first, Councillor Frost, then Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you, Chair. It was really just a comment, just to basically say what you've just said, and the fact that I found the report very easy to read, and I think that officers should be commended for that. And the process map and the officer responsibilities was key in actually helping me understand the new way forward. And I hope that will be something that will be circulated, if adopted, to every councillor, because it's a very visible way of us knowing, what the procedure is, who's responsible for what, and where we currently are, and where we can expect consultation. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to also commend the report. It's excellent and lays out really well where we are on this. I've got a question about the parish council. I have 3 parish councils in my ward. Are we going to talk to them individually or as a group of parish clerks or whatever, just so as we can, so they can understand the new process, so they can see where their involvement can be fed in, and they understand what the new 106 world can fund and what it can specifically do for each parish or wherever those developments are being made?
Chairman, I think the simple answer is yes, and I think we can pick that up at future parish meetings and talk to parishes as a whole about Section 106, but also about the emerging position on SIL. So we'll take that away, certainly.
That's really helpful. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. Looking back in time, I can remember when I think it was around about 2004, there was a motion put to, I think it might have been the Audit Committee by the opposition then, the Conservatives, seeking greater involvement by ward members in deciding on the Section 106 funds coming from developments. And I myself completely supported that. And it's here 2017, and we still don't really seem to be going any further forward with regard to influencing what might be applied for. We don't really want to be told that we've secured funding for open spaces when maybe in the ward there is a need for something that's more relevant to that community where the development is being built. Looking at the map, the process map, I'm assuming stage 1, where we have planning application received, ward members consulted on the application. Well, that's planning. That's not 106. That's to do with planning, I assume. That's telling us what the application is and so forth. Likely need for Section 106 agreement identified. You go down to 1, 2, 3, the 5th blue box, scoping pro forma added to planning application file available online. And this is the point I want to make. It goes across to the green box saying members can view scoping pro forma and for major applications contacted by case officer at 6-week stage. Are you saying by this decision tree that members have got to diary forward 6 weeks time to then look to see whether actually there is what the scoping pro forma is going to be? The advice to ward members needs to be more, by officers, needs to be more proactive than that. Can we not have some trigger whereby ward members are advised at that stage by email or some such, not expecting us to remember that we've got to look in 6 weeks' time on individual applications? Because I've got to tell you, in a ward like Eastrop Central, you can't do that. I'd have to have a separate diary, and that's where it falls down. I'd like to be able to, as a ward member, be at the early stage of that discussion with the planning officer.
Matthew, do you want to comment?
Just some thoughts a bit on the hoof. I understand the point which is being made. I'm conscious that in terms of the general management of larger planning applications, and we're really only talking about larger planning applications here because they're the ones that generate a need for Section 106. Officers in the planning team should, of a matter of course, contact the ward councillor and say, look, this is a significant application. Have you got any initial thoughts? And it seems to me that there's possibly scope within that communication to include a reference to Section 106 and the sorts of thoughts we've got, or officers have got, in terms of what Section 106 is justified in this particular instance. It's always worth reminding myself that in terms of Section 106 is that the government guidance is very clear that it has to be a need generated by that development, without which that development would be unacceptable. So there are clearly constraints about what a Section 106 can include, and I know members are aware of that. So, but I think maybe there's some opportunity there as part of that communication between the case officer and ward councillors to include the Section 106 element to it. I'll have to think it through, but I think there's certainly scope to provide that additional communication, if that would be helpful, and we can work that into some additional work.
Just a quick comment before I go back to Councillor Parker. You said as a matter of course officers should contact the ward member on large applications in their ward. I don't mean to point the finger, but I certainly haven't found that to be the case as present. In particular, the case that sticks in my mind off the top of my head is the largest planning application that this borough's seen in some time. The ward member was not contacted with regard to Section 106 contributions.
And that's useful, and I'll take that away, and we'll reinforce that amongst officers. I suppose the particular application you dealt with, I think inevitably is going to be dealt with in a slightly different way, and I anticipate as part of our assessment of the application there will be some sort of briefing event for members in due course to get their feedback. But I'm hearing messages that perhaps that communication around major applications isn't as consistent as it should be, but we can go away and reinforce that with the team.
Thank you. Councillor Parker.
Thank you for your support in that, Chair. That's really the point that I'm making. My understanding of the process internally within the officer that have input into the award of Section 106 of various services, whether it's for transport, whether it's for open spaces, is that they could all make an application for an amount of money or for a certain level, and then that gets decided, as you're saying, Matthew, within the government criteria. Certainly any negotiation that I have with the planning officers is very detailed, very supportive, but it's the one thing, the Section 106, there isn't that trigger that reminds me that maybe we could have a conversation, i.e. the lead planning officer and the ward members, as to whether the thinking is matching. And if we could move in that direction, Chair, that would be very much appreciated.
Sure. I see the officers taking notes on that, so that's fine. Are there any more questions or comments from the officers on this paper? I mean, we're asked to provide comment to the portfolio holder on this particular paper, and I think the main comment, if you like, from the committee is on that engagement and making sure that ward members are spoken to and I use the word consulted, but certainly kept informed of what's going on with regards to large applications. Councillor Parker?
Yes, I think if I could just ask for confirmation in relation to the table 1 on page 53, which oh, sorry, I'm on a different paper. I apologise.
That's okay, we've jumped ahead of ourselves, but I think we've got the comments on item 8 on the agenda, so we will move forward onto the paper which you're looking at, which is the item 9, which is the planning obligations for infrastructure supplementary planning document, which seeks to clarify how planning obligations will be sought alongside SIL in the future, and is supported by a draft supplementary planning document which will be consulted upon, and I believe that Mark Lambert is going to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. As you've outlined, the approach to the draft SPD is that it will function alongside SIL once that's introduced later in the year. So it sets the other side of the equation effectively. We've got an existing document that sets out how we will secure planning obligations at the moment. It was prepared back in 2005 and has been updated since to reflect new values and costs. But clearly with the new regime coming into effect with SIL and some other factual changes, we need to be in a position of having an up-to-date draft SPD going forwards. As you'll see before you, the draft SPD covers all different types of obligations that we would generally seek to secure. There's a summary table on table 1 on page, I think it's the table Councillor Parker referred to, 53, thank you, which sets out the areas covered by the SPD. And the SPD itself goes into more detail around which policies in the adopted local plan they support and which pieces of evidence base they relate to. So, for example, or other strategies that the council has. So, for example, for community buildings, it will refer to the relevant policy in the local plan and the community building strategy to outline to applicants how we will secure obligations for that particular issue going forwards. Just to flag up a point that Matthew made earlier, planning obligations have to be in line with government regulations around how they're used, and that there's obviously the pooling issue to take into account. So that's also factored into the draft SPD. What we would like to be doing next is to consult on the draft SPD, so that when we come to adopt SIL later in the year, we're able to adopt the SPD at the same time, and we're able to present a comprehensive picture for applicants to use when making planning applications to us. Members' views are sought on the paper and the draft SPD, so that we can make any changes prior to consultation on that, starting in mid-May.
Thank you. I think we'll go with questions to officers first, and then we'll try and go through the options analysis by option, so that we can make sure we get the full range of comments from members. Councillor Parker, you had your hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. I was wanting to make a suggested alteration, so I'll give way to anyone else that has questions of officers. Questions to officers first.
Thank you. Are there any questions for officers, or are we happy to go through the options analysis? Oh, Councillor Richards.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So am I on the right one? Is this payments in kind? There's a mention on page 69, appropriate to take payments in kind. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? So, you know, what sort of things are we going to get in kind, and how is the valuation assessed? You know, to make sure that because the thing presumably is worked out as a money thing. This is how much you owe, and then, well, okay, let's do a deal, and you know, I'd just like to know how that thing goes on.
Theoretically, if you're using the payment in kind approach, you're able to place a value on a certain piece of infrastructure and the costs associated with that. So when you're working out the SIL bill effectively, you are able to discount that quantum from the overall SIL that's liable to be paid to the council. So in terms of a particular piece of infrastructure kit, let's say, for example, a community centre, we know roughly speaking how much a community centre costs to build. We've got experience of doing that in the past, so we're able to take that into account. And if need be, we could get further detailed valuation advice on that to ensure we're getting an accurate picture.
So, I mean, there is a sort of a negotiation going on there, then, isn't there? Because the developer will say so much, and we'll say so much. So there's a point of challenge to come into that, isn't there?
There may be potentially. I'm not commenting on a particular application, but we clearly have a track record of knowing how much these things cost, and we're able to take advice from other parties in that respect. So we should be in a strong position in that discussion.
Councillor Fell wanted to jump in.
I just wonder, Chairman, I could ask the question about whether we could include within this broadband or IT infrastructure, because this has cause problems not just in the rural areas, but actually those who may call themselves not quite so rural in some of the new developments, where they're in a blind spot for a broadband cabinet and have had to somehow either encourage BT or fund it. People expect, especially in the more urban environment, these facilities to be on tap or the equivalent, and if they're not, the developer ought to be in the mix, I would suggest. And certainly in the rural areas, if some people get 20 houses plopped on the side of their village, and yet there isn't, and they still haven't got broadband at the end of it. They've got 20 very unhappy people moving in there, and the rest of the village still possibly slightly unhappy too. Whereas actually, if we could actually, the money raised could go towards funding for a broadband cabinet, it might allay some of the concerns that have been raised. So is that possible, do you think? That's a question.
I think it's something that we can look into in a bit more detail. And I'm aware that in the past there's been appeal decisions that have been contrary to that approach, where the inspectors haven't supported an authority who is seeking to introduce broadband through a planning obligation. But I understand the white paper does provide a little bit of guidance on that, so it's something we'll look into in a bit more detail.
Please, thank you. Say this, Chairman. Clearly, the decisions in the past where people didn't understand about coverage, we're now down to this last 5%, and people are being told they're just not getting coverage. So somewhere the money's got to come. And everyone's now, the government is starting and saying, well, everyone should, well, the previous leadership would turn around and say everyone should have broadband firing around the place. And when you've got places that have less than half a meg, it's not very good.
I'd agree with that. Certainly in some of the rural areas, we talk often in the economic strategy and things about 5G, which is all very well, but quite frankly, my residents in Ramsdale would be happy with 2G. Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you. I support Councillor Raffel's comment about IT infrastructure. I think it would be a good addition to the planning obligations. I think it's a necessary thing for us to be seen to be acting on behalf of all of our residents, not just those who can access fibre in the urban areas. I'd like to, on page 53, down at the bottom, I know it's my little hobby horse, you've got flood protection and water management. Can we strengthen what we've got there, where it says to manage flood risk and deliver sustainable drainage systems? We've already had a motion to full council, which was accepted, about the discharge into water courses and the protection of our rivers. Could I see that section a little bit more strengthened in obligations to the developers? I would really like to see what we do to our environment strengthened. I'd like us to see it being Basingstoke being a pinnacle of good water quality at every level. And obviously, we have to take account of the fact that we have got flood risks, but we also have waterways that are some of the most endangered in the world in terms of our chalk rivers and chalk streams. And I would just like something a little bit more robust on that, if I could.
Something that we're happy to look at in a bit more detail. Obviously, it needs to be in line with the regulations around how it can be used, but we can take that away.
Are there any more questions? Councillor Parker.
Well, as my colleague, Councillor Ratkin, has moved on to table 53, can I make my comment in relation to that particular table? I wanted just to ask that under cultural infrastructure item, it reads new public art at strategic sites where it is necessary. Well, I would think in terms of when people are talking about funding public art, there would be a considerable lobby that might say, well, this isn't necessary. Is there perhaps a different word we might be able to change from necessary to desirable? Public art feeds into a community sense of well-being. It's I know it's considered in a lot of instances a luxury, but in actual fact, to some extent, it's one of those contributing factors to a community spirit and sometimes also used very essentially to maintain the history of a certain community or the environment. So I don't know if these are words or are they the words that are put on to us by some other greater body. If there are words, could we change necessary to some other, and I'm suggesting maybe desirable.
I think that's a reasonable suggestion if we're able to do that.
Just to say that the words in the table on page 53 are merely a summary of what's actually contained in the draft SPD itself. So it's just intended to give you a flavour of the issues covered and the typical requirements. Obviously, the word necessary is in line with the regulations in terms of how you should use a planning obligation going forward. Planning obligations should be there to mitigate the impact of development, and one of the tests is that it's necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms. So we've just used that term in summary there to be consistent with the government regulations.
Councillor Parker.
I did it without even opening my mouth. Then I might ask, maybe we can add our word, desirable, necessary, or desirable and necessary. I don't mind which preference, but it would be nice to see desirable in there.
That's a good compromise. I hear. Just while we're on that table, I'd like to perhaps hear more, if it's appropriate, about on the next page, page 54, you've got the remainder of that table, which talks about employment and skills. Can you just talk us through how financial contributions towards developing employability skills would actually work? That seems quite interesting.
Actually, Chair, it might be helpful to have in front of you page 83, which is the part of the draft SPD that gives more detail on that. And I'm just going to skim read it as I'm talking to you, really. Yeah. But effectively, what we're trying to achieve is an improvement in skills levels associated with a particular development, where you're able to perhaps get a skills plan in place, and these are generally taken forward on a case-by-case basis, in line with a particular site of a significant scale. You would generally seek to have in place training opportunities for local residents, local people, to be able to perhaps take on apprenticeships through the local college and be employed in those sites going forward. So we'd look for the local population to assist in delivering the sites effectively on the ground.
That's helpful. I guess my question really is, how does the money get from one to the other? Is it the fact that the Section 106 goes directly to a school, college, higher education centre? Because of course we don't have any further we have higher education in Basingstoke, we don't have further education, so I'm just wondering how that works in practice.
Well, today I'm not aware that this has taken place in Basingstoke. This is quite a new feature of the SPD. Clearly we have good linkages with the local colleges and the sixth form colleges as well, so there is scope to help to develop particular courses to train up the local population. The SPD makes particular reference to science, technology, engineering and maths as key issues where the local population needs to be perhaps upskilled in some sense. So that would be where we would look to focus our efforts, and really working with colleges to make those courses available.
That's really helpful, and you said it's something new. It's certainly not something that I've seen hugely before, and that's something that's really good if we can do that. Are we happy to, Councillor Richards?
Sorry, can I just follow up on that point, because that interested me too, actually, this on these STEM things. I mean, I still don't quite understand. I mean, we think you're giving a bursary to Queen Mary College or something like that, coming out of the SIL money, in order to fund students and encourage them to do into STEM subjects? Is that how it works?
It's something perhaps I can take away and get back to you with a bit more detail. Given that it's quite a new subject to us, and it's only drafted at this stage, we haven't actually worked through in practice how that would operate on the ground, but we can certainly give it some more thought and get back to you as a committee.
Alison, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that planning obligations aren't always financial contributions. They can be actually like things that are arranged. So, for example, if we got a planning obligation for an employment and skills plan, which was for a development to get local people trained up and working on that development and learning skills, that would be a planning obligation, although it might not be a financial contribution. It would be something that actually does still benefit the local community. And I think with this employment and skills section, we were really looking for the type of planning obligations that would be very usable and, you know, straight away to benefit local people, so not necessarily financial contributions, although if we did develop a partnership and specific courses with colleges in the future with links through our economic development team, which is a possibility, we could extend that to financial contributions.
That's really helpful. That certainly helped me understand that a bit more, rather than writing a cheque to a college. You can, you know, encourage a particular site to employ local people and to be upskilling the local population. I know that's something which we've spoken about, or I've spoken to about with a number of members, and that's something that we're really interested in looking at in the future, so that's really helpful. Are there any more questions, or are we happy to go through the options analysis for some, so that we give a very clear steer? So on page 55, we have under 4 options analysis. So 4.1, no SPD on planning obligations, which would rely on the Regulation 123 list to specify where infrastructure is intended to be funded through SIL, and the council would not seek planning obligations for these forms of infrastructure. Do we have comment to make on that particular point? I see Councillor Golding.
Only to say that I wouldn't support that option.
That's helpful. Do we have any advance on that? I think looking around the room, we're happy with that. So option 4.2, so planning obligations SPD focused on infrastructure, which is the approach taken through the report, which would result in further guidance on the scope and scale of planning obligations that the council expects once still in place. We've been commenting on that, but I assume that we're all happy with that approach. Yep. Okay, so that's the desired approach with some further information around the points that we've decided. That leaves us with 4.3, which we ought to cover off for completeness, which is a planning obligations SPD covering infrastructure and affordable housing. Having just adopted the previous option, I think we're clear on that. So if we're all content, we will move on to item number 10, which is the SIL governance and spend paper, which sets out proposals for how SIL can be spent in the future. So leading on from our previous discussion about raising SIL, this is about, once we've got the SIL money, quite how we govern and spend that. And I believe that Mark again is going to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. This report is really setting out some ideas as to how we could go forward in terms of spending and prioritising SIL once it's in place towards the end of this year. We've taken the approach of looking at various other authorities and best practice that we're aware of, and we've tried to present to you a series of options as to how this could be taken forward. So it's hopeful that we'll get some views from councillors this evening on which of the approaches they find favour with, or if there are any other ideas as to how we could approach this. It's worth pointing out that effectively when SIL is received by this council as charging authority, we're able to retain between 70 and 80% of that. The balance of that, 15 to 20, 15, sorry, I should start again. We're able to retain 70 to 80% of the SIL that's collected by the authority. There's a 5% administration charge cost that we're able to retain ourselves to administer and manage the process, which we would intend to do. This leaves a balance of 15 or 25% of the SIL that's passed on to the neighbourhood as a neighbourhood fund, which is passed on to the communities involved. So if I can perhaps deal first of all with the proportion that we retain, which is the 70 to 80%. This is the area where we've presented 4 different options for how we could prioritise and spend that money going forwards. And I would like just to run through those quite briefly, but they're set out in the report effectively with more detail in the appendices. Option 1 is really focused on a bidding process where we would invite service providers and infrastructure providers to present bids to us upon a criteria which we've determined. And this is an approach that council have take forwards. Just in terms of a couple of advantages and disadvantages, this does give the Borough Council control over how the money's spent, because we're in the driving seat in terms of considering those bids, setting the criteria, and then determining where the money is directed. We're able to align those with council priorities and the council plan, and to consider where sites are coming forward and the types of infrastructure required to support them. But we do recognise that the process was likely to be both resource intensive for ourselves in administering that, and for the bidders in putting forward their submissions and bids to us. There's also some concern that if we're spreading the SIL income too thinly, we may not have sufficient to actually deliver on our strategic priorities, which is really the purpose of SIL. So it's therefore an option that we as officers aren't recommending we take forward, but again, we'd like your views on these. Option 2 is around setting a particular proportion of the SIL income and then passing that directly on to different service providers. We're aware that in Winchester this system operates, and they pass on 25% of SIL income to Hampshire County Council for them to use in terms of education and transport and other services they provide. This clearly gives clarity to the service providers on how much SIL income they're likely to receive each year and going forwards, and it's relatively straightforward to administer. But on the downside, there's a danger that we lose some control of that as a council, because we're passing money out quite quickly, as well as making it quite difficult to align the spend of that money and the location of new development, which is obviously the purpose of SIL overall. Again, this isn't an option that we as officers are recommending we take forward. Option 3 is focused around prioritising what's on the Regulation 123 list, and that's really the list that determines where we will spend SIL. So it will be a case of going through that list and working out where our priorities lie. This allows us to remain in control of the process going forwards, and is something that operates in Fareham at the moment, where they've used their SIL income to effectively save up to provide a leisure centre. So again, this could be something that we use to address our particular strategic priorities, and then begin to take them off as the SIL income accrues over time. And really that's quite a key message of this, and it applies to all the different approaches, in that SIL won't necessarily come in terribly quickly to start with. It will take some time to accrue, and it may be that we have to wait for some time before we're able to start to provide that particular piece of infrastructure. But overall, having looked at the approaches available to us, this is the one that officers are finding favour with. But again, your views are sought on that. The final option that the paper puts forward is to divide the SIL income into different spending pots effectively, and to start to save up for our different pieces of infrastructure that we feel we need. We could also start to attribute some money to lower value items that would obviously deliver quicker wins, but we're clearly spreading out the SIL income into lots of smaller pots, and it potentially takes some time to deliver any of those. In some ways, this begins to become kind of contrary to the approach that SIL recommends, that the government recommends we take, in that we should be providing for the strategic infrastructure. Hence, we feel it should be in line with the 1, 2, 3 list and a prioritisation around that. If you're comfortable with that, I'll move on to the neighbourhood fund, which is the proportion that's passed on to the individual parishes or communities in the borough. As I outlined at the beginning, they will receive either 15% of the SIL income for development in their ward, in their parish, or 25% if they've got a neighbourhood plan in place. And so there's obviously an incentive to get a neighbourhood plan in place to achieve a greater proportion of SIL. In the parish areas of the borough, the process is quite straightforward. The money is passed on to the relevant parish or town council, and they're able to spend that money in line with the definition of infrastructure set by the government, and that's set out in the report. And it's quite a broad definition. The more challenging part arises in the unparished parts of the borough. So effectively, the majority of Basingstoke town, where we don't have parish councils in place. And this is an area where we've given quite a lot of thought to how we could operate this in practice. Government regulations require that we should be attributing SIL and working out the priorities in consultation with the local community. And clearly where a neighbourhood plan is in place, that's straightforward and is clearly set out, or indeed where there's a community plan in place and we're able to see what the particular priorities are. But where they aren't available, then we have to use some kind of judgment based upon documents that we have already as a council, such as the community investment framework, the community buildings strategy, where we know something about the local wards and what the needs and wants are of those communities. We also need to be mindful of the local infrastructure fund that we currently operate and have been doing so for a couple of years, to make sure that it aligns and works in parallel with that. So I think we recognise that in the unparished areas there's perhaps still a little bit of work to do, but I think we'd really welcome your views on how we could develop this going forwards.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I'd just like to say thank you, I think, on behalf of all of us, for it's an excellent paper. It's really good and really good, clear set of options for us to look at and go for option 63, no doubt. What I'd like to do is go to, if we do questions first on points that we want clarity over, and then if we go through the options one by one, we can assess the merits and see where we go from there, if everybody's happy with that. Okay. If we have questions, I have already got a list in Councillor Richards, Rattigan, Golding, Frost, and then Parker. Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm a bit puzzled by the distribution to the parishes. I don't understand why, if they have a neighbourhood plan, you get 25%, and if you don't have a neighbourhood plan, you only get 15%. Because, of course, there are very good reasons as to why some parishes don't have a neighbourhood plan, and yet you're punishing them, we're effectively punishing them.
That particular issue is one that's governed by the government's regulations, and they stipulate that those particular proportions.
Can I just ask on that point? I understand it's in the government guidance, but is the government guidance that it's 15% and 25%, or is it that it's at least 15% and at least 25%? Alison.
In the regulations, it specifies that where there is no neighbourhood plan, it is 15%, and that is capped at £100 per dwelling in the existing parish per year. Where there is a neighbourhood plan, it is 25%, but it is uncapped. And it's not flexible at all. It's either 15 or 25%. No, it's just as it is. Yeah, just 15 or 25. That's it. Although the Borough Council does retain its flexibility to spend the remaining 70 to 80% as it wishes. If it wished to allocate more, then it could. But the government guidance is 15% or 25%.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Councillor Richards, did you want to come back on that, or are you?
No, I hadn't realised it was actually written in the rules. I just feel that it's a little unfair in that someone like Tadley, you see, we've actually made a decision not to have a neighbourhood plan because we have the planning restrictions due to because we're in the neighbourhood of AWE and all that sort of thing, there's no point in us doing it, you know, because we can't have big developments. So we will look to the generosity of the council to provide some of that extra 70 to 80%.
I think that's going to be key, certainly for me as well. I've got some rural areas and rural parishes who simply can't afford a neighbourhood plan, and they've taken a conscious decision not to do a neighbourhood plan on the basis of cost. And we do have some parishes I know in the borough which don't even have a precept. So they would never be able to afford a plan, and I certainly wouldn't want to see any areas penalised for not having a plan. Councillor Rattigan was next on my list.
It's about the LIF, if I can. I wouldn't like to see anything undermine that, because it's been fantastic for my ward in Kingsclear. It's been a really easy way to access money. I'd like to see it strengthened in any way possible. And obviously, you know, long term, a parish like Kingsclear will get additional money from its developments, because obviously it's going to have an adopted neighbourhood plan long term. And Ashford Hill and Headley, that's not going to be the case. So I'd like to be able to access money wherever I can for deserving community causes. But I also would like to see money split into different pots, but also like a big pot for big prioritised things. You know, if we could just name things for it, which isn't just a pot of money for something in the future. If we could name pots, it's like my parents used to have pots on top of the mantelpiece for electric and for council tax. I know it sounds really boring, but I remember the days when people actually saved up the money and then spent it, rather than spend it and then try and earn it. I think that would be really useful. But also, it is important that we're going to get the money in slowly initially, that we don't just go for big projects, that we really help the community and use the drip and then flood of money in a concise way, but also a targeted way, so as we can show our residents that this money's coming in and is being put back out to help them. So lists of what we're doing, how we're doing it, where the money's been allocated, and how much we still retain, I think would be a thing for our audit committee in the future as well. So I think there's quite a lot of work on this to make sure that everybody understands what's coming in, how it's being spent, and is it being spent wisely.
Yeah. Did you want to comment on that? Mark?
Just really on your last point, there is an obligation on the Borough Council as a charging authority, as we will be, to clearly set out, you know, where what money's been received, where it's going, and so that will cover the points you've just made.
Councillor Golding was next.
Thank you. On page 94, it talks about SIL can be spent on any infrastructure that will support the development of the area. Can I just understand what's defined by the area? Because I think we have a potential, some real inequalities, particularly in the town area, where we're all sort of being lumped in together because we don't have parishes, which isn't our fault. We're nice anyway. But particularly wards like Winklebury, ones that are so close to so much development, if we're all treated as one, that really just doesn't seem fair. So will the money raised by Many Down SIL be treated in a more local area, as in prioritised by developments in Winklebury and in the surrounding wards, or will it just be a free-for-all?
At this stage, we haven't clearly defined the process, but the intention would be that it goes into a general SIL pot and is distributed from there. So, unless members have a contrary view, when this process is finalised, that would be the approach that's taken. Clearly, the LIF would still be in place to, you know, refer back to where that money was raised, and we shouldn't forget that there will be Section 106 obligations that will seek to mitigate the impacts of a particular development locally where it's necessary.
Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. To be fair, the basic thrust of my question was covered by Councillor Rattigan, but I would just like to again reiterate the fact that it's very important that we demonstrate to our residents that the city is being collected and also spent. So I appreciate that whilst it would be great to actually spend it on and save it and spend it on big infrastructure changes, I think at the start we would need to actually spoon feed some smaller projects to actually get basically our residents aware or raise our residents' awareness of SIL and the fact that it's being spent wisely and is for their benefit, rather than being potentially put it aside in a reserve somewhere and saved for a really big infrastructure project that residents may not be able to see coming along for years to come.
Thank you. I think those points have been noted. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. To make it easier for officers and colleagues, if I refer you to pages 98 and 99, starting in relation to this, my comments, paragraph 54, 55, 56. From my reading of this and listening to my colleagues in support of their rural areas, it seems to me as though the town centre wards are the poor relations in respect of receipt of funds, the application of those funds, and the decisions taken by the council as to how best to allocate monies. The difficulty I have here is that the complication between LIF and SIL and neighbourhood funds. We've got a situation in the Eastrop Central Ward where we have had permitted rights developments now in excess of 750 units, where you see in the report that it's currently proposed that flats will be rated at 0. Now, I argued against this at the previous committee meeting. There's obviously been no movement in this area. I can't understand how anybody can consider that any development of flats, whether it's permitted rights or whether it's through full planning permission, shouldn't qualify for some contribution towards community improvements. Because for certain, I would defy anybody to suggest to me that the Berkeley Tower development of some 243 flats is not going to have some impact on highways, schools, recreation and medical services. You say in 5.5, particularly, the council will need to take a view on the geographical scale at which the neighbourhood fund is allocated in the town. I would ask you, first of all, please, to define town.
My understanding of town is those wards that are within the urban area as defined in the local plan, where there isn't a parish in place.
Fine. It would be good maybe on the full council report you attach a map to the document so that can be properly understood in the debate. I don't necessarily take particular issue in the principle that is being expressed, but I don't want to spend this evening wasting colleagues' time in picking on individual sentence or words, but it does worry me that the inference is that the direction will move more to using the funds rather than individual serving or satisfying individual ward needs. I think it's weighted too much in that emphasis, and I'm uncomfortable with it, and I would speak against it if there's no way that we can modify that prior to full council. Because the situation, the big question that comes to my mind is, how will you comply with the SIL regulations if you apply that approach in getting community agreement? It will be very difficult to get community signing up if you've got conflicts between residents in different wards in relation to a development in one specific ward. We've had this at council one time when there was use of funds that generated from one development. I think it was in Chinham or somewhere else that wasn't used somewhere else. I think you're going to have considerable difficulty in complying with the regulations and requirements of that. It talks about the suggestion and recommendation of community plans, and talks about how those community plans can be advantageous, but also in the same paragraph highlights that these take a long time to mature. We've therefore got to look at safeguarding the situation between the development of community plans. How do we take care of the immediate future? That's particularly, I think maybe I've strayed across to comments rather than questions, but those comments I think perhaps generate some questions of the officers.
I think they're very well made points, particularly with regards to making sure that the town centre areas get their fair share as well. I think those are very well made. Do the officers want to make any comment on those?
Other than saying they're noted, and we will look into those matters in more detail, and we're aware that the report isn't finalising the approach, so we can certainly take them away and consider that in more detail.
I think I'm just going to cut in here. You mentioned, Councillor Parker, that this would go to full council next. If members here decide, it doesn't have to. And I think that's one of the key points for me, in that there is actually no rush with this. There's a rush in the sense of getting SIL in place with regards to a paper that we considered earlier. But on this, just the governance and spend, if we have comments, we can make those comments, the officers can take them away, redo a paper, and we can look at it again and make additional comments. So we can really look at this as an ongoing piece of work and make sure that we get it right. And I'm certainly keen that we look into it and get it right, particularly with those town centre areas, making sure that each areas are going to receive the right amount of money. I think if members are happy with that, I mean, we'll go through the options and come forward with our suggestions, but what I'd like to see at this moment in time is the officers go away and re-pull something together with something that we can really move forward with and examine again and make sure that it's right for us. Councillor Parker.
Thank you. That's very helpful and a good steer. One thing can I just add to my comments, because I did lose sight of that, is just to, and it's on the back of something that you said, is that a lot of the services provided in the town centre are enjoyed by members and residents of the whole borough, not just those residents living in the town centre. They are serving the community of Basingstoke-Deane Borough, and therefore that's added pressure. But it seems to be that we're getting the little end of the stick of rock and having to, everyone else is having a lick at it.
Councillor Raphael.
Can I invite Councillor Parker to, if he thinks that he might want to just express this on paper as well, to consider putting some further submissions in writing to the officers, because as they're saying, this is work in progress, and whilst we've taken on board his points, there may be others, I'm sure, once he's thought about different issues, different examples of things in the town that are all the borough gains from, and being the centre of the borough, for which the new residents and the new developments will congregate in. So, and as he's the ward member for the centre of the borough, he's probably got quite a bit to say about that.
Councillor Parker.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Farr. That's very helpful. I would like to do that in conjunction with the other ward member, but I would ask if I can do it after the 5th of May.
Or perhaps even the 8th of June.
Well, no, I'd like to get on to it a bit quicker than that, actually.
Maybe that's a statement. I think if we're all content, I'd like to try and do this reasonably structured. I think, are we all content with, firstly, the 5% which the officers have identified we are able to spend on administration? I think that seems eminently sensible. Councillor Richards.
Sorry, 5% of 30 million is quite a lot. Yeah, 1.5 million. Is that the cost of administering this? I mean, it did seem rather a lot to me.
That's over the whole plan period, so that takes us up to 2029. So it's not a significant proportion each year. We do have to install software to service SIL and administer the process electronically, and there are quite a few processes that officers would need to go through to ensure the smooth running of that service.
Don't mention government procured IT services. That does work out about £115,000 a year on administration of SIL. But Councillor Rattigan had a point.
I just presume also that will be going to audit and accounts for us to review and understand the spending on that.
I think that's something I'd need to check, but
I think on the basis that we're going to go away and bring this back, I think that can be looked into in the fullness of time. If we park that for one moment, so we're happy in principle, subject to understanding how that money would be spent, and if that's a sensible amount of money, we then go to the 70 or to 80%. Option 1, which the officers have identified, a bidding process for the infrastructure providers make bids on an annual basis for specific infrastructure projects. Do we have any comments to make on that? Councillor Rattigan.
I think it was too top heavy in administration. I can't see small community projects looking forward to bidding for money, failing, and then having a bid again on something else. I just think it's cumbersome and it wouldn't work.
Councillor Frost.
Councillor Rattigan said it all again.
Okay, I think we're all agreed there. Option 2, pass a percentage to each infrastructure provider. So looking at Hampshire Education, Hampshire Highways, Hampshire Library Services, and then BDBC Community, Sports and Leisure, Parks and Open Spaces. Councillor Frost this time.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully Councillor Rattigan can agree with me this time. I have to say that I'm not very keen on this option. I think whilst it's eminently worthwhile, splitting the money up and allows people to identify the money that's coming on stream, I don't see it, being able to be used for prioritising the big infrastructure changes that we need in the borough for our residents. Thank you.
Councillor Rattigan.
I agree with Councillor Frost, and obviously, I just want to make a comment that why would we be handing money over to Hampshire County Council with the way they want to destroy us anyway?
I have some sympathy with that view, given that the first item on here is Hampshire County Council Education Authority, and I'm not entertaining that we go for this idea for one moment, but my concern would be passing out money straight away with no guarantee that it would be spent on Basingstoke schools, and I think we've got evidence to show that in some cases. So if we move on to perhaps, sensing the way the discussion's going, it would be sensible to do option 4 and then come back to option 3, which I sense will stimulate slightly more discussion. So option 4, split the funds into different pots, such as higher or lower value, allocating the majority to higher value infrastructure. Do we have any views on that? Councillor Golding.
I don't dislike it. I don't think it's quite right, though. I have an addendum to option 3 that I think would be better, but bring in elements of the benefits of this.
So perhaps we take the two together. So option 3 is prioritise items on the Regulation 123 list. Councillor Golding, would you like to outline your thoughts?
Lovely. We've already spoken quite a lot at length at some of the inequalities across the borough on this, particularly between parishes, between people, parishes that have neighbourhood plans, parishes that don't, particularly those of us in more urban areas that don't have parishes at all. I would suggest that we give a flat 25% to all areas, because that would mean that we could have a priority list with the remaining. We could do our big strategic, big ticket items, and we could prioritise them. But then the smaller items, we could have a bit more of a reactive, more flexible, more community-led approach that I think would benefit and actually would give all areas of Basingstoke, all different communities, an ability to access that. And I think we would be able to administer that easily, but also fairly.
So I think it would be some work for the officers on that to work out quite how we do that whilst complying with the regulations. But as I understand it, that could be done. But what we would be looking to do is that in all areas, so if you're in a parish, you get 15% if you don't have a plan. You get 25% if you do have a plan. But what we're suggesting is that they all get 25%. So we give them the 15% that we have to give them from the government, but then earmark another 10% for them as well, which we keep in a pot somewhere for real local ward level projects. And then in the unparished area, we try and hold that at ward level, perhaps, in consultation, or we hold it notionally in a ward fund. Councillor Golding.
Sorry, I'm very supportive of the community-led plan aspect of this, because I think one of the reasons at the moment community-led plans are quite slow and difficult to get off the ground, Brighton Hills has taken about 2 years and we finally have a team of people on it, which is great, is that they're quite nebulous things with very little kind of tactile value, whereas I think actually if you can say, look, if you've got a community-led plan, there's a bit more, it'll be easier to access a pot of money. That genuinely really would help wards like mine.
So perhaps then if we're talking about allocating, we have to allocate 15% to parishes. If you did 15% to parishes or in a pot for a ward, and then there's an additional 10% which the local area gets if it has a neighbourhood plan and if it has a community plan in the case of an unparished area. You've then got 5% spent on administration, then you've got the remaining 70% on the Regulation 123 list. I've heard a few yeses. Are there any comments to make on that? Councillor Parker, did you have a comment to make on that?
I think a sharing is a very good basic principle, and I hadn't given any great thought to any detail, but listening to the suggestion, I think it has a lot of positives about it in terms of how it's perceived by residents within the borough, that this is an equitable way of handling funds on that fundamental, but I don't think it's fair for me necessarily to comment on this, the 15% and how you deal with your 25%. I'll step out to that one.
That's helpful. Councillor Richards, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I was just going to make a point. This option 3, it's it suits me. Providing, the real difficulty there is the prioritisation of this Regulation 123 list. That is the key to this, and I don't know how you set about that. That's going to be a difficult procedure. and I haven't thought it through, but that needs to be thought through, you know, to a greater depth. To actually, you know, how do you set up a committee? Who's on that committee? How do you know, because it's absolutely critical, because everyone, if it's a load of members, they're going to push for their own wards or their own parishes. There's got to be some levelling mechanism in the discussion there, I think.
I'm looking to the officers for guidance on the Regulation 123 list. Have you found the...
I've got a note prepared earlier on this. Really, we'd look to establish some kind of criteria as to how you could go through the 1, 2, 3 list and work out what should be at the top and which should be further down. But effectively, it would be taking into account projects that are needed more urgently, or where there's clear delivery plans in place to make that happen, where there's scope to lever in funds from other sources perhaps, so you can have some match funding, where a particular project is going to support the delivery of new homes or jobs. That's going to be another important consideration to factor in, and really to ask ourselves what would happen if that piece of infrastructure isn't provided. Is something, you know, significant going to occur in the absence of that? So those are the kind of things that we've kind of got in mind so far.
I think that sounds good as a start of a 10. I think it'd be really good to get some more clarity around that. One of the things that I'd be keen to see on that is as a high, if it's going to be a points-based system, if you like, around those points, you know, if you fulfill, yes, it's very needed, you get 10 points, etc. One of the criteria I think should be proximity to the development. So I think I'd want to avoid at all costs a situation where, if we take Many Down as an example, we're building the houses on Many Down. As ward member and my parish council, as Wootton St Lawrence, they're happy because they're getting their contribution, which will be 15%, or hopefully once we've got a neighbourhood plan through, it'll be 25%. But on that Regulation 123 list, I'd like to see things that were in that part of the town prioritised first. So I don't know quite how we'd do it, but if, for example, at the top of the Regulation 123 list, there was something down in the southeast, southwest of the town, of course that's very valuable, but on the money levied from Many Down, that should be going towards the communities such as Winklebury, such as Rooksdown, such as Buckskin, which are surrounding that development, so that they're getting their bit. And then likewise for the developments down in the southwest, you know, we talk about the golf course, we talk about Hanson Fields, we talk about Kennel Farm. It'd be good to see the money from there go towards things down there, not up in the north. I don't know quite how that's given you something to think about, I guess. Councillor Rattigan.
I agree with your point about a geographical weighting. I think that's quite important. I think it will show where there's a development and you're showing the mitigation and the community infrastructure being produced. Also, you know, if we are all here tonight, you know, maybe the team that's here tonight could be on the committee, and others who are not here tonight, obviously they wouldn't have the opportunity to be on that scoping panel. I just put that ahead. You know, I know they'll be watching on the internet, so maybe that's a thought for the future.
I won't comment on that. Are there any other comments on where we've got to? If not, I'll try and summarise a bit so that we're all slightly clear. But I think we're saying that option 3 is the best of the 4 available options, but we'd like to see some amendments. So we're talking about 5% for administration, yes, but we'd like to see how that money's actually going to be spent and if that's a sensible amount of money given the amount of money that we're raising. So some clarity around that. Councillor Frost.
Sorry, Chair, I understand with the 5%, and you're right to say that we want to know how it's spent, but more importantly, we want to actually see how it's audited.
Yeah, and that picks up on Councillor Rattigan's point on the Audit and Accounts Committee, which I'm sure we can look into. And then we have the 15% which must be given to parishes, or 25% if they have a neighbourhood plan. But I think what we're saying in the unparished areas is that equivalently we'll give 15% to a ward area, or 25% if they've got a community plan, building on Councillor Golding's point. Possibly something to look at. something to look at. Councillor Frost again.
Yeah, Chair, I like the idea, but again, I think we have to be very careful how we basically administer this, because it could be that part of a ward has a community plan and part of a ward doesn't. Okay, so therefore, how much money you're actually going to give them? Are you going to give them sort of in between, or are they just going to stick it at 15%? So I think that needs a lot more thought on how the community plan is going to be developed to make sure that it either covers all the ward, or alternatively we have a pot for each community.
Councillor Golding.
Thank you. Sorry, my suggestion was on using community-led plans to help spend the money wisely. It wasn't a suggestion. I think, as we've been arguing, that actually all parishes should actually get a top-up to 25%. I think all urban wards should also get a top-up to 25% as a blanket. But you get more entitlement. It's easier to apply for funds if you have a community-led plan, because we know exactly how you already want to spend it, and you've got that evidence there, because that's what a community-led plan is.
That's far better said than I said it. Councillor Parker.
Sorry about that. Yes, I think for better understanding in this loose-term community plan, I can well imagine that where you have a rural community, close-knit community, in possibly a high percentage of residency retention, people who've lived in that community, maybe families, 3 generations. In the ward that I represent, we have such a high percentage of transient residents in terms of they don't live 6 years, they don't live 6 months. Sometimes where they're living, they move on. It's very temporary and therefore very difficult to get some enthusiasm or input in terms of whether we would be able, the benefits of a community plan, and therefore we are at a disadvantage if the hook's going to be a community plan. I think that would disadvantage in terms of allocation of the funds, whether you've got one or whether you haven't. There's a big question mark against that for me. So I rather like, your councillor's suggestion that we should get a share of it, whether you have or regardless of whether you have a community plan or not.
I think that point's well made. Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst I understand, I think I've understood Councillor Parker correctly in the fact that basically saying that you want each of the wards to have a certain pot, but not to be based on community infrastructure plans, which I understand, but why should it be that if one of the parishes in my ward, for example Oakley, who has a neighbourhood plan, a village plan, or a local plan, get 25%, and after they put in all the hard work to actually get the local plan and have it adopted, and yet some other parish in my ward, for example Dummer, where there is no local plan, why should they get the same amount of money? They haven't done the work. We've got to have something which differentiates the amount of funding that people get for, or local areas get for the work that they put in, and up to now it seems to have been either a community infrastructure plan or a local plan. And I think that if we would turn around now and just say that everyone in the town got a set amount of money for a ward, irrespective or not that it had a community plan, I think that would be quite a bit of a kick in the bits for, I would say teeth, but unfortunately my own teeth got kicked in the weekend in a triathlon. But the issue I have, it's a big kick in the teeth for those parishes that have already done the hard work.
You can, Councillor Councillor Parker.
I don't, actually, is the very short answer. I don't know why. But I would rather think that the spirit of developing a community plan wasn't initially in order to be eligible for receipt of contributions. I would think that those people who are fully committed to developing neighbourhood community plans see other benefits other than just receipt of funds. It's what it can do for the direction they want to see their neighbourhood developing. It has an impact on planning, which is a positive. They have some influence in regard to planning applications, the outcome of planning applications. I think this is just one small consideration of the benefits of a community neighbourhood plan.
You took the words out of my mouth. I mean, it's certainly from being involved in a very small way in the 2 neighbourhood plans in my ward. I mean, yes, the gaining an additional amount of money for Ancilla is definitely a motivator, but it's not the only motivator in a neighbourhood plan. And we need to make sure that, you know, no system's ever perfect, but I don't want to see our very small parishes disadvantaged because they can't afford a neighbourhood plan, because they don't even, some of them, as we said before, some of them don't even levy a precept. And to Councillor Parker's point, there are some communities which are transient by their nature, which wouldn't ever be able to get a community plan or a neighbourhood plan off the ground. So I think if we are asking the officers to look into this, you know, and we'll bring this back to committee, but if we're asking them to look into it, it's a case of we'd like to give or allocate 25% to the local area, be that the parish or be that the ward, but quite how we do that we need to look into. And then on the remaining 70%, I think we're all happy with the concept of a regulation 123 list, but what we'd like to see is some more furnishings around the criteria for that 123 list, and perhaps a points-based system. And Councillor Rattigan put it far more eloquently than I did, but on geographical weighting I think will be an important part of that, as well as the need for that particular infrastructure. Would everybody here be happy with those comments? And then I would propose that the officers go away and look into that in more detail, and we'll bring that back. And is the portfolio holder happy with that? Yes. Would you like to say anything? No? That's great. In that case, that's that item covered off. Councillor Frost.
Sorry, Chair, I'd just like it noted that I don't agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I...
Yeah, whilst I understand that local plans do give significant benefits to parishes and community infrastructure plans, okay, you know, I understand the rationale about giving every ward a blanket 25%. I just don't necessarily agree with it on the criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. As I say, we'll bring the item back to committee, and we'll make sure that we can look at that in more depth, and we'll make sure that we can try and get the right solution. Moving on to item 11, which is a review of the committee's work programme. Clearly this is the last meeting in this municipal year, but on the 8th of the 6th we've got a review of strategic regeneration, and then at the next meeting we're looking at the economic growth strategy, monitoring the borough's water environment, which was Councillor Rattigan's motion from full council. We've got residential permitted development in there, and then at the next meeting in November, intermediate housing policy, and then in March of next year, Basingstoke Business Improvement District annual update, which we received at the last meeting. I know that we'll have the motions coming back from full council, will be scheduled in there in due course. Councillor Rattigan.
Chair, with your permission, I would like to raise the issue of the quality of new builds within the borough. A number of residents, not just in the town centre, but in the outlying areas, have commented that the snagging lists on some of the houses that are new build are absolutely appalling, and some of these houses are not fit for the residents, even though they are moved in and find that they have not got lintels on windows. They've moved into houses that are unsafe. There's work that's still requiring done, and yet both for the housing associations and for private buyers, the quality of the build is absolutely appalling. It has been raised by our MP, or the MP here for Basingstoke, Maria Miller, and I just want to say I think it is something that's really important. We're going to build a lot of houses in the future, and we ought to know that the developers know that we're on their backs if they cheat, because that's what it is in terms of the build, the quality of the build, and what they expect people to move into on the purchase of the biggest financial commitment of their lives. So I wonder if I could bring that to your attention and maybe see if we can do a piece of work. I have flagged it to Councillor Bound on this issue, and he has issues himself in his own ward. So I wonder if I can talk to you, email you on that issue. Thank you.
Absolutely, I think that would be a very valuable piece of work to do. As you said, the MP for Basingstoke, Maria Miller, I think she's Vice Chairman of the APPG for Quality in the Built Environment, and that's an issue that she does care about, and I think we do need to be looking at those issues. So I think if we get together with some other councillors who feel strongly about that issue, and we can look to put in a work programme suggestion form formally to the committee, and we'll look at that properly. Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Jim. I just wanted to check the dates. Are these correct? These still dates? I mean, the 8th of June, the next meeting, is that correct?
I believe so.
Well, I'll probably be counting if you... I don't know, what are we doing on the 8th of June? I don't know.
Oh, sorry, I must apologise. I did change that meeting, and it is now... Is it the 12th? No, it's the 12th. I do apologise. I did when the general election was called, but obviously the papers went out before that.
Yeah.
I did speak to our Democratic Services officer, who agreed that we would change the date of the meeting to, I believe, Monday the 12th of June. Is when that was changed to. So, yes. And there was an email that went out. Yeah. Well spotted. Okay. In that case, there are no items for exemption, and thank you very much, everyone.